All right, so here we go. It's been a while since I've been able to post anything on our YouTube channel, so I'm hoping this is helpful. You guys should have your notebooks open to 16.1 because we're going to start talking about genetic equilibrium. If we just think of that word equilibrium, if you are in equilibrium, you're in balance, okay? And so we're going to be looking at when populations, the dispersal or the percentage of time that you see certain genetic traits when it's in balance, and what would cause it to go out of balance. And when you change your genetic equilibrium, you are actually having evolution occur. So we're going to look at what is genetic equilibrium, how do you maintain genetic equilibrium, then what happens if it's disturbed, and when you disturb genetic equilibrium, the result is the formation of new species. So that's where this is all going. So we're going to look at reviewing genotypes and phenotypes. We've looked at the bell curve, that there's natural variation within populations, and a lot of times it's found with most of the individuals being right in the middle and a few outliers on either side. We saw that with our handspan lab. We're going to look at why genetic variation occurs. We're going to learn how to calculate allele frequency and phenotype frequency, and hopefully you remember those words, allele and phenotype. And then we're going to look at a mathematical representation of genetic equilibrium, which is called the Hardy-Weinberg genetic equilibrium. So we're going to do a little bit of math. Okay. So, oops, too fast. So, we are looking at a population, and like I've said before, our classroom here, we are all members of the same species, at least I think we are. And I know that hurt, didn't it? And we are all Homo sapiens, but we are not all exactly the same. And so we're looking at all the variation that is within our population or any population of the same species. If we looked at our handspan data, and if we had a large enough sample size, we would have seen that our handspan was really in a bell curve, a normal distribution. And we can have different things that will cause changes in that distribution. Random mutations, recombination, which is going to be crossing over, and then the random pairing of gametes, because each egg and each sperm does not carry exactly the same genetic combination from the parent. So when you have different egg and different sperm coming together, you get a different offspring. And that's because of crossing over. And you remember that from meiosis. The gene pool, for example, in our classroom, the gene pool is going to be, if you take all of the different genetic traits that we each carry and you add them all together, that's our gene pool. So if we have a lot of diversity in here, we have a good, deep genetic gene pool. But when you have organisms that are all the same, you don't have a lot of diversity, and then that causes concern for the future generations. For example, cheetahs, there aren't a lot of them left in the wild. And so they're trying to do recovery efforts by breeding cheetah in captivity. And the problem is that since they have such a small gene pool, there aren't that many individuals. There's not a lot of genetic diversity. The whooping cranes, another example of an animal that was on the brink of extinction. There were only something like 41 of them left. And they've done all kinds of captive breeding programs and releasing them, and they've got the population back to much greater numbers now in the hundreds, but they're all traced back genetically to that very small gene pool of only 41 individuals. So genetic diversity is a good thing. Allele frequency. All right, do we remember the term allele and what that word means? Allele. Okay, an allele is just a version of a trait. And frequency is going to mean how often you see that trait. So your allele frequency is going to be how often you see a certain trait in a population. So what are the different combinations of alleles that we can have? Now you got to think back to genetics and Gregor Mendel. What are the different allele combinations that we can have? What if you're carrying 2 dominant traits? What do we call that? Homozygous. There we go. This is homozygous dominant. And if you are carrying the 2 recessive traits, we're going to call this homozygous recessive. And there's one more variation, big A, little a, which is called, okay. You didn't really know what I was asking for when I first asked you. What are the different combinations called? So we're going to learn how to calculate what the frequency is. If we know what the frequency is of one allelic combination, we can calculate the other ones using the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So, predicting phenotypes, we can go back and forth from phenotypes to allele frequencies and back and forth. If we know that, if we counted up all of the individuals in a population, that would equal 100%, correct? Okay? And so keep that in mind, that you know you can go from, you can go from 100%, if you convert that into a decimal, is what? 0.1, right? Keep that in mind as we go on and we do Hardy-Weinberg. Now, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Two mathematicians, Hardy and Weinberg. Okay, they used mathematics to prove that evolution has to occur by proving what conditions must be met in order for evolution to not occur. So they proved the existence of evolution, change over time, by proving, hey, if evolution isn't going to occur, these are the conditions that must be met. Okay? And they said that allele frequencies in the gene pool do not change unless they're acted upon by certain forces. So what are the things that act upon allele frequencies that would, what are the conditions that need to be met in order for Hardy-Weinberg to be true? No mutations. What else?
Individuals do not enter or exit.
Okay, so no enter or leave. It's like Hotel California. Actually, in Hotel California you could come, but you couldn't leave, right? So no immigration or immigration. What else? Next.
The population is large.
Large population. We're missing one.
Individuals mate randomly.
Yeah, and pure random mating.
And selection is not occurring.
And no natural selection. Well, gosh, okay, let's think about the human population here. In order for the human population to not evolve, no mutations. Okay, so your DNA can never change. From generation to generation, there is no random mutations. Well, that would be great, right? Because if we had no random mutations, then we could eliminate cancer. Okay, so we're not going to have any more mutations. No one can enter or leave. All right, well, so that means that nobody can move around. You have to stay put where you're born. You cannot change countries, no states. You must stay in your area, and no moving around of populations. Okay. Well, we got this one covered. We got a large population, right?
Yeah.
But what about, there's a town called Brenda, Arizona. I've driven through it, taken signs, pictures of the sign. There's only 6 people that live there.
What?
Yeah.
What's that?
I don't know, that's it. Yeah, it's just like a couple of buildings, and that's it. No one likes Brenda.
I like Brenda. She's awesome.
Brenda, Arizona, that is. Okay, so I don't know. We're gonna have some really small populations, but I don't. We'll go with that. We can say the human random mating. Oh, for humans, I don't know.
Like, are you asking like seasonal?
Well, we're talking. You don't get to choose your mate. Oh, we got a problem with that one, right?
It's like when you set you off with one of them.
Well, but even if you're being set up with somebody, there's still some selection process. The way to do random mating with humans, it would have to be a lottery.
Close your eyes.
It would have to be, this person and pick a number with this person, and you reproduce and no natural selection. So there can't be anything in the population that is going to allow for certain individuals to be more suited to survival than others. So do you see how crazy this is? I mean, we're taking it to extremes, obviously, with the human population. But is it possible for all of these conditions to be met? No. And so Hardy-Weinberg, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says, evolution has to be occurring, because you cannot in a population have all of these conditions met all the time. It's an impossibility. Have you guys written down everything you wanted to off of this slide?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm moving on. This will be up on YouTube on the channel, so if you want to go back and watch it again. Okay, so it's a theoretical model, And in this theoretical model, the gene pool is totally stable. No evolution is happening if you meet those requirements. And that's why we say it's a genetic equilibrium. It's totally genetically balanced. And by saying it's a genetic equilibrium, that means that the frequencies of traits are not going to change. And so this is the example in your book. I want to draw your attention to some things to start off with here. And I did a much worse job last period. So first period, sorry, I'm not going to post the video that I did for you guys because it wasn't good. And this one's much better. It had been a year since I'd really looked at Hardy-Weinberg, so I'm going to be a lot smoother this period until I'm not smooth and then I make a stupid mistake. All right. So in the Hardy-Weinberg equation, we have to wrap our heads around the fact that the value for P, our value for P is going to represent our dominant trait. So I'm going to use the R's here. So P is going to represent the R trait, and Q is going to represent the little r trait. Okay? So whatever letters you use, okay, whenever it talks about the recessive allele, they're talking about Q. So P is the dominant, and Q is the recessive. Do you have that in your notes? In your population, if you add up all of the dominant traits to all of the recessive traits, it has to equal 100%, right? Okay. Okay, so our P plus our Q is equal to 1. So always our dominant alleles plus our recessive alleles is going to be all the alleles that you have in a population. If you can figure out what your, if it tells you how many individuals are recessive for a trait, you know that you are given the Q squared. Q squared here would be the recessive. So what would P squared be? The homozygous dominant. And what would PQ be? So if you're given q squared, how do you figure out what q is? This is math now. If you've got q squared, how do you figure out what q is? You do the square root of q squared equals q. Okay, it makes sense. It does. It actually makes sense. So we're going to go to this Bozeman science video. And I want you to watch this Bozeman science video, and then we'll pause it, and we will solve the equation. And this is where my lecture is going to stop. So you would go and follow the Bozeman science link, and we'll watch it in class. But I don't want to repost his video, so we'll stop here.